We've looked at real source data here.
It's going backwards, but it's not quite going backwards as fast as it was.
The states that are doing well and the states that are not doing well.
Current time plus 3 months plus 6 months plus 9 months plus 12 months.
Post call, Sydney will give it a run for its money in terms like over price growth over the next 6 months. We're going to put Melbourne at the bottom. Sydney's going to give it a run. Which state should I buy in September 2024 edition? We're going to introduce a whole new concept in this episode, the Confidence Finance, the Reedham and Curtis, the property clock for Australia. We're going to unpack, deep dive, look into the data, unpack the economic data in each state across the country, and tell you where we think the macro property market is at the moment. We've looked at real source data here, not other property clocks. We've just unpacked what's going on state by state, looked at key data metrics, and we're going to look at exactly where each state is. Curtis, this is the #1 podcast we have ever produced, was which state should we buy in, part 1, part 2. And in this episode, we're going to go through New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland, September 2024 edition.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. And for this one, you know, you've introduced a new concept, the property clock as well, which is exciting. We've changed cycle to clock, and now we've got a new cool term to play around with.
Yes, I needed to do that. Key insight, because if you go back, go check out the previous podcast. I think it was a year ago. I said Brisbane and Perth, freaking hell, the data for Brisbane on a tear. And Brisbane had already risen a lot, being like, Brisbane's going to do really well because the data suggests it's going to do really well over the next 12 months. And lo and behold, Brisbane has done really, really well over the course of the last 12 months. Perth was a very obvious one. And yes, it has done very, very well. Yep. Adelaide's done really well. The data has matched what we said 12 months ago. This isn't us tooting our own horn. It's very easy to say this. It's pretty easy to tell you which market's going to do well over the next 6 months. Perth is going to lead price growth over the next 3 months for sure. 6 months probably, 12 months likely. Like I can tell you that to begin with. This isn't all that difficult to predict, but making bigger assumptions about where things are at the property clock, that can give you a little bit of early insight as to where to buy, depending on what sort of investing strategy you want, whether you want to follow the data and buy something that's going to go boom, boom, boom right now, or whether you want to, be an early adopter. We talked about that as well and some of the risks associated with that. And now we're going to go through everyone's favorite topic.
Yeah.
Where should I buy, Reedham? It is the #1 question we get asked.
All right, let's go New South Wales first, because it's probably, to be honest, one of the, I would say, least exciting states to go through.
Yes.
We've got a little bit of data here, but currently like 0.3 growth rate in New South Wales. So
actually, can I stop you there?
Yeah.
Before we get into New South Wales, give me a little whip around of the latest data for the country.
Okay.
Let's just do the high level macro before we get into the states.
All right. So if we don't break it down and we go just Australia wide, we've got property still growing, but at a slower rate.
Yes.
So it's previously 1.3% kind of at growth across the country. That's down to about 0.5. So still moving up, but at a slower rate.
Yes.
We've seen asking prices decline very, very marginally across the country. Rents still shooting up pretty significantly. Vacancies also have popped up nationwide. There's an increase in the amount of properties being listed. So properties on market is up, I would say, relatively significantly over the last year. Population growth up 2.5%. Unemployment rate is up a little bit, like we've covered on some previous podcasts where we've been running through the economics.
Yes. Yeah. Cool. I'm going to give a little bit of a simpler digest of that. Australia is two-speed market. West doing really, really well. Queensland housing market at least. Brisbane housing market and Townsville as well. Mackay up there doing really, really well. Other housing markets, Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, regional Sydney, pretty much not doing very much. A little bit of intricacies to that. We'll talk about that a little bit more, getting into the data a bit. But nationally, we have a slowing economy, slowing a lot, a low-ish dollar, and the high interest rate environment is really permeating into the states that are doing well and the states that are not doing well. We've been here before in the early 2000s, and pretty much if we had this podcast then, if podcasting was a thing then, it would have been the same sort of narrative. Perth doing really well, Sydney doing really badly. They almost correlate with each other. When Perth does well, Sydney does badly. That is happening right now. And nationally, it's being driven by high interest rates, slowing economy, high population growth, masking over how slow the economy is actually doing, people feeling the brunt, consumer confidence really low.
Yeah.
You have all of these things that are permeating into the macro factors that drive these state performances. Let's get into New South Wales now. I wanted to provide that context for
All
everyone.
right, sounds good. So
when we say New South Wales, we mean Sydney, by the way, as well. I think.
pretty much, yeah. So, so price is pretty flat, 0.3 growth rate. But pretty flat. So do you want to give a little bit of a summary of how you see the Sydney market? I got a couple of other factors here we can run through, but do you want to give a bit of a general overview?
Yeah. Right now, Sydney is going through a very heavy listing spring season.
Yep.
Whether that's in the data yet or not too sure, but it is going to happen where we just started spring and we're going to see a lot of supply coming into the marketplace. It's going to put pressure on prices, and the economy is slowing, unemployment is rising. So the macro conditions for Sydney property aren't that pretty. And you're seeing that in high-end properties at the moment. You probably see prices fall now. I'll go so far.
Yep.
Prices are falling in parts of Sydney. Not to a really material sort of degree, but a small fall, 2, 3, 4, 5%, which is not unusual. So you'll find buyers have a little bit of purchasing power there. Broadly, market is pretty flat though. So on balance, Sydney in general isn't doing all that much. Hasn't been doing that much in the first 6-9 months of the year. It's up a bit, a few percentage points over the rest of the year. I don't really think prices will move at all. I think it'll just be like 0 or 1% up or down. So effectively, pretty much nothing happening to prices in Sydney. The market's just transacting, balance between supply and demand. On the pro side, we've got rates coming down at some point in the future. That delay, the continual delay in that conversation is driving confidence down. But you also have strong housing fundamentals. Future supply is really, really weak. It's not going to be any good. It's going to suck. We have a lot of data here, but I'm just using these brush words. It's going to suck. You've got percentages here. I'll let you put the numbers to it all. But that's the real framework that I have for Sydney, and I'm going to call it property clock. As of today, past its peak.
Yeah, I think the data that we're seeing at the moment kind of supports that the market is softening in pretty much every aspect. So growth rate is pretty near 0. It hasn't tipped negative yet, but asking prices are down a little bit. Rent prices are down a little bit.
Yeah, I noticed this actually. Yeah. I had to discount rents.
Yep, vacancies are up a little bit, which is consistent with that. So it's all the property factors are pointing to like some weakness is starting to come into the data, that things aren't as strong as they were previously, which is kind of consistent with what you're saying. It's maybe a bit past its peak. I think the only thing that is looking like a potential, not necessarily strong point, but where there's a bit of a supply and demand imbalance is, like you say, like dwelling starts are down 30%. Like on the supply side, there's like very, very little coming online. So demand is weakening off. But at some point, which might not be in the immediate future, if demand is to pick back up, I think there is going to be a pretty big supply-demand imbalance, right? Because the supply is just not coming online at the moment, at least in the current data.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good summary of Sydney. So the reason why we're on our phone here is we're looking at so much data, a little table that we've put together with all the key statistics. So I'm going to read them out really, really quickly. Property price change since COVID, up 30%. Sydney is up 27.2%. Price growth, it's risen in prices over the course of the year. It's still rising at 0.3% in the latest month. Asking prices are coming down though, which is your lead indicator for what I've just said earlier.
It's softening.
Flat, it's softening. Asking prices, the lead indicator for actual prices, coming down. It's an interesting one. The rent price falling, vacancy rates rising, properties on the market up 22% over the last 4 months versus this time last year. So more properties are coming on the market, but the houses are clearing. We've got a 70% auction clearance rate. So, buyer demand is kind of meeting the supply uplift with a little bit of price pressures in some locations. Population growth rates really, really strong at the moment, and no supply coming online anytime soon. Projects have all finished, and you can kind of notice it. There were so many cranes up in the sky everywhere you looked. Infrastructure boom. New airport, new motorway, new metro stations, new. Sydney was a little baby city being completely rebuilt. infrastructure massive boom and housing construction boom through the low rate environment. Now it's been 3 years since that time. No one's building anything in Sydney. Even the government's like, I don't really want to build anything anymore. Can we finish this up? That's the setting we're in at the moment. So, fast forward a couple more years, that just means there's not enough homes when demand does rise.
That's kind of the seeds of the next boom, so to speak.
Exactly.
But that's when you go around the property clock, that's like a little bit into the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the reason why I've got past its peak is because we will do another one of these in a few months' time. So in that few months' time, in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, at some point in the next 18 months, whenever we do this, I'm going to say boom when it comes to Sydney. I'll give you the heads up. We'll know it. We've said it before. I've said it in March. I've said it in May 2019. Said it in June 2020. Basically, every time Sydney is at an inflection point in prices, we get an early insight. It's pretty easy to tell. Our phones just go off. It goes nuts. People go from, I want a pre-approval, I'm thinking about buying, to get me that pre-approval yesterday, Rita. And, we feel it. Like, it's just the best way to describe it. We feel it in the conversations we have. Right now, we have the general conversations of, let's get a pre-approval. I'm looking to buy. When am I looking to buy? This time period. Maybe I'll look into stat. Maybe I'll do this. Maybe I'll do that. That's the general conversation we have at the moment. Market's in balance. But Sydney has demand that stampedes, and we get the early stampede sense of that. So at some point, I will be changing this past its peak, right at the bottom, past its peak. Like, prices will fall over the next little period, albeit very, very marginally, to boom all the way to the it's go time. But that is not now. It is when the financial settings change. It is when those rate cuts come and whether APRA comes to the table, and when there's other changes that come in and change the sentiment direction around, and when the economy starts picking back up associated with all of these changing financial conditions, Sydney will go back into its boom period. But it's not now. It's not anytime soon. And between now and the next pod that we have doing this Confin property clock or whatever we've called it, it will cycle back down. But right now, past its peak, not so good.
Yeah, I think for Sydney, people need to be able to borrow. So, I would say, the conditions for that are going to be on the back of, quite a few rate cuts that come before it's in that position to boom again. And then, like you mentioned, the lack of supply that's there, maybe 2 years down the track or 18 months down the track or something will sow the seeds for price rises. So that's Sydney, New South Wales. Let's do Victoria, Melbourne. So even a little bit softer than Sydney, I would say. So prices falling. They falling less slowly. So they were previously 0.4, now kind of 0.2. Negative, that is. Asking prices also falling, vacancies increasing. So dwelling starts down there as well, not by as much as Sydney, down by about 13%. Softening market similar to Sydney, but state economic output is also pretty flat.
Let's start with the big call.
What's the big call?
Where is it at the property clock?
Oh, where is it at the property clock?
Should I answer this one?
Do we give them like names? I would say it's at 6 o'clock. It's at like the bottom of the trough, whatever that
is. That's it. That's what everyone wants to hear. Everyone loves the data. But where is Melbourne on the property clock? Let's get into the data. Bottom. That is what I call it. Prices are moving backwards in Melbourne. Melbourne at bottom. And we talked about it before in our previous pod, or in one of our previous ones, where there will be a stampede into it at some point. So right now, at the bottom, I don't think it's past its peak, even though prices are falling, bottom. Let's keep going into the data. I think people wanted the high level. First.
So it's going backwards, but it's not quite going backwards as fast as it was previously. So I think going through the data, the concerning things, or the thing that concerns me most about Victoria and Melbourne is basically the economy is not really growing there. And in order for it to come out of that trough and kind of move on to the next phase, I feel like there needs to be some strength in economic activity, income, employment, those types of things that support the price growth to come out of that. The indicators aren't really there for that yet, but in terms of the cycle or the clock, it seems to be kind of in the middle of the trough. Is how I would describe it. So a little bit further on than, say, where Sydney is at the moment. It's a bit further around the curve.
Yes. That is the broad summary of where I see Melbourne too. The reasons why Melbourne will do well at some point in the future is obviously there's a high demand for it. So, the most populous, or it's going to be the most populous city at some point soon. Its supply levels are down. People aren't building there. So it's got the same Sydney sort of dynamics there. But here are the key reasons why Melbourne's going to do pretty well at some point in the future. Now, I think I got berated on LinkedIn for this recently. Someone told me to basically start just to stay in my own lane, being like, you're an idiot for this, because shedding something about the spread between Sydney and Melbourne prices hasn't been this high in a really, really long time. And yes, there are reasons for it. Yes, the Melbourne state economy is doing really, really poorly. Yes, they're targeting investors. Yes, the cost of ownership in Melbourne is higher. So the net property investment cost is worse there. But at the same time, prices have only risen 11% since COVID. So prices have fallen in real terms, or in and around the same level as COVID. Meanwhile, Sydney's up 30% and all the other states are at 60, 70, which we'll talk about.
Yep.
Melbourne is comparatively cheaper. It's now cheaper on a dwelling basis, at least, than Brisbane and Perth. Its rents, so this is underlying house demand, has risen a lot. I'm looking at a chart of asking rents as we speak at the moment, and it's significantly higher than it once was. Like, we're talking 30, 40% increases in rents over the last few years, but prices haven't risen all that much, which is making the yield go up, which is going to start attracting investment activity at some point, because that rental buy equation in Melbourne is going to start with rate cuts at some point in the next year or two. People are going to work out it's cheaper to buy in Melbourne than rent. Let me say that again. It is cheaper to buy in Melbourne than rent. When that statement is a fact, it is not a fact at the moment. It is a statement that is not true at the moment. It does not apply. But at some point, with rents rising so much, house prices falling, and interest rates coming down at some point, that will become a fact. When it becomes a fact, Melbourne will not have small level price growth. Melbourne will go boom. Melbourne will go gangbusters. Just like I said, Sydney is predictable. Melbourne is entirely predictable too. It's so easy to predict. And that makes so much sense. Ask a Melbourneite being like, do I want to rent this home or do I want to buy it? Where's the price of this home going to be in 6, 12, 18, 24, 3, 5 years? They're all going to be like, kind of makes sense to own it, doesn't it? Like, they're going to go through that number crunching process themselves and be like, let's buy. Let's makes a lot of sense. Why would I rent? Why am I paying rent here? We get CGT concessions, we get all the ownership benefits. Let's own. When that's the case, Melbourne's going to go like it'll hit a new equilibrium price where you get where that spread adjusts again. So there's a little bit of information about Melbourne there.
Yeah, and it's got like you say, just essentially from a few years of relative poor performance, like it's got the room to grow when conditions allow, which isn't quite right now. But yeah, we're in the trough basically. So at some point, that's going to turn, and its direction isn't, hey, I'm going to collapse even further. Its direction is, okay, I'm recovering, I'm booming, I'm catching up some of that price growth that I haven't had relative to all the other markets in Australia.
Yes. So here's 3 things I'm going to give people for Melbourne and Sydney. They're both going to be the poor performers.
Over the
next 6, between now and the next one, poor performers. I think I said that on the last one.
Yep.
They've been poor performers. It's going to be poor performers as well over the next 6 months. So that doesn't necessarily mean don't invest there. Who invests for 6-month time periods? Like, you're talking years. Poor performers over the next 6 months. But here's what you want to look at when you are deciding whether to invest in Melbourne or when to invest in Melbourne. Here's a few things. One, that rent or buy equation, when it spits out green, if it does ever spit out green, then you're probably a little bit too late. 2, you want to be looking at the employment market and the economy in general. Economy is weak at the moment. It is a consumption-based economy, and that consumption is falling because of high interest rate settings. So unemployment is rising, and Melbourneites are feeling real wage pressures as well. With high inflation, incomes effectively not rising for an extended period of time, unemployment going up, lower economic activity, really poor state budget that really needs to take money out of the system when it needs money going in. It's going to need that for an extended period of time. They need to raise taxes or cut expenditures to meet their budget needs for a period of time. Property investors are going to be targeted continually over the next few years. There's a lot of with Melbourne, and that will remain for a little bit. But when the economy turns, that is another green light. You'll get some insight into that from us. We'll talk about that. And then the third bit is interest rates. Melbourne is their economy is going to be tied to the interest rate environment. And these three factors are going to be driving Melbourne there, because and the reason why it makes sense is the underlying factors are there. Melbourne will remain one of the most in-demand capitals in Australia and in the world. It has a very low current supply of dwellings coming into the marketplace because of the feasibilities that are there at the moment. These supply frameworks are poor. The fundamentals are there for Melbourne to do pretty well at some point in the future. So when these three narratives change, that is when Melbourne will go boom and he'll play catch up. And it's the outlier, it's the city that's like, we're out there somewhere. So it could do really well at that point in time.
All right, so that's Sydney, Melbourne. So let's maybe jump to one that is less of a non-performer, low performer, to one that's a bit more flying. So Brizzy.
Love this one. Do you want to go through? So let me say where it is on the property clock.
Yeah, actually, this is an interesting one.
I'm trying to, maybe I use clocks don't make much sense to me, so I'm using this in a bit of a tricky sense. Brisbane price growth will fall over the next 6 months. Is that the right statement? So I want to
still growing, but it's going to grow
more
slowly. It's not going to grow as quickly as it has over the, say, previous 6 months.
You know what? I'm going to go a little bit further. Yeah, I want to be more controversial than boring property clock.
All right.
Just says
Are you going to go past its peak again?
Just one little thing slightly below that. So over the next 6 months, Brisbane price data will be positive, right? The reason why I know that is because it just posted a double-digit monthly increase. But I also track property data for years. I also know that when you have double-digit price rises, it means that the property market is pretty hot. But that double-digit it's got 1.1%, 1.3%.
Yeah, 1.1%.
1.1%.
Yeah,
like it's on fire at the moment. That is going to go to a halt within a 6 month time period. It's going to go from up here to like really, really fast growth to near nothing. The reason why this is going to happen is it's no longer affordable. Like it's risen a lot.
Yeah.
Brisbane has had 60, it's led the way. It's like the capital post-COVID. Perth is going to lead the way in total because it's rising faster. But so far, it's pretty much leading the charge or in and around there. It's up 60%. It's up 60%. Like
COVID wasn't that long ago either.
Yeah. And most of that rise has been recent, like in the last 2 years as well. So I think Brisbane will grind
out some positive results.
It'll be between 0 to 0.5% growth within 6 months. Its growth rate will more than half.
Yeah.
Between now and January next year.
Yeah. So coming to the end of its boom cycle, basically.
Yeah. What do you call that? Coming to the end? Is that where?
That's, I don't know.
You call it?
2:30 on the clock.
2:30 on the clock. It's 2:30 on the clock. It's lunchtime, or we're just past lunchtime. It's going for a little nap.
Yeah.
Siesta. That's where Brisbane is on the property clock. Let's dive into the why and what the data says.
Yeah. So the data's still relatively strong. Like prices up 1.1%, like we mentioned. Asking prices also up 3.3%. The one thing that looks to be softening off is rents are down 1%. So rents are no longer rising as much. That's the indicator that is softening a little bit and might be, I guess, the leading indicator that it's not sustainable for it to continue growing at the same rate, which obviously it's not, but like we might be getting to that kind of point where it needs to level off. Vacancy rates are still pretty stable. Yeah.
I feel like I've called it too early. Can I backtrack?
Wind the clock back, literally and metaphorically.
So the reason why is 6 months is too, it's hard to, what I'm trying to speak to is property investors. Will I invest in Brisbane now? The answer to that is probably not.
You might have missed the boat a little bit.
Yes. The answer to that is you missed the boat. Now, if I'm in Brisbane and I'm a property investor in Brisbane and I'm only
Are there
looking
still
at
opportunities? Yeah.
Will I make money over the next 6 to 12 months? Will I make another 10%? I think the answer to that's yes. Will I make another 10%? Yes, over this time period. But if I'm a Brisbane property investor and I'm purely let's just say it's click a button on a stock. Let's just say property is a stock. Am I hitting sell? Yes, I'm hitting sell. That's the button I'm clicking on Brisbane right now. I'm hitting sell. But I'm also saying that it's going to rise.
It's got a little bit left.
It's got a bit more than a little bit, if that makes sense. So, and because we're doing this repeatedly, I feel like this 6-month period, Brisbane will be the third best performing capital, and it's going to perform really, really well on any sort of benchmark. If you rise 6% or 7%, I think it's going to rise between 6%, and that is the January figure, 0.5% growth. Between now and then, you have 1%, 0.8%, 0.8%, 0.7%. That's like
still solid.
It's close to double-digit growth over the next 6 months alone. Like, so that's pretty good. But at the same time, rents coming back down, affordability tightening up. It's a high interest rate environment. The economy weakening. You have, and it's really expensive now. You have all these factors going in, being like, oh, okay, like why am I investing in there at the moment? So that's kind of what I meant. Yeah, you're convincing me through all of the data that you're telling me right now. It's making me unpack it a little bit more.
Yeah. So
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. All right, we've just gone back half an hour. That's all right. Brisbane doesn't believe in like daylight savings anyway, so you wipe an hour off the clock, right?
There you go.
Just for that. So the data's still looking strong, but early signs that it might start to level off, I think. And that's mainly in the rents. To be honest, the other data's all pretty healthy. That's probably the biggest consideration. But given the very, very strong growth, like you say, up 60% since COVID, obviously that kind of growth rate is not sustainable just on an indefinite basis. So I think the question for Brisbane, and maybe to some extent some of the other states that we'll go through in another podcast, is how much further is there before it needs to start, before it reaches the natural point where it starts to level off. And I think what you're getting at with saying, 2 o'clock is that is on the horizon. It might not be here now, but you can start to see that coming in the near future, in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months. It's not going to go the same as it has. Yeah.
It's hard to say that one with clarity because they might get how I said Melbourne has these interest rate and economy.
Yeah, well, if rate.
So, like that's the 12-month period, right? So, like if rates fall 100 basis points in 12 months, Brisbane might be like, actually.
Go up another 10%.
Yeah. So, let's it's just hard to unpack it in the right words. I'm struggling for that a little bit on a podcast, which doesn't make much sense. But what I'm trying to say is Brisbane has had its big run and it will slow, but it will still do really well versus Sydney and Melbourne. It's gonna be like, men against boys, basically. Like it's gonna kick its ass. It's gonna kick Sydney's ass, basically, between the two. But at the same time, like, you're buying in a riskier market when it's up so much so recently. But and then the reasons for buying there and the reasons why it's still got this 10% growth that you can see in the short-term horizon, which is pretty freaking good, 10% growth in the short-term horizon. The reason why is its economy is doing pretty well, relative to others. Like it's got good sort of current fundamentals. I am reading the winds a little bit here, and I'm saying that these economic indicators suggesting it's doing well is going to turn over the next 6 months. Its economy, the change in its economy, that's the big buzzword. Yeah. It's going to change backwards over the next 6 months, and that's why its growth rate is going to go from up here to coming down. Yeah, because the current economic growth is really good, and that's what everyone's looking at, being like, yeah, Brisbane's really good. I'm saying that in 6 months' time, by the time we do our next podcast, the economic growth, it's going to have good positive growth, but the economic factors are going to weaken there. That's what I'm trying to say.
You might have to wind it back to like 1 o'clock then.
Yeah, 1 o'clock or 1:30 is what I'm getting to.
If we keep talking, you're going to be like back to like it's in the middle of the boom. But no, I think like that's probably a decent summary. Is the numbers probably look almost as pretty as they're going to get, for Brisbane at the moment. So the numbers are going to maximum prettiness basically in the numbers, but that's not obviously going to be sustainable forever. So your kind of reading of the winds forecast is that, hey, the numbers are going to come in softer and softer as we go, current time plus 3 months plus 6 months plus 9 months plus 12 months. Yep. The numbers are going to get weaker and weaker. Exactly. And that initially is going to result in still positive growth, but maybe less of it before it eventually levels out.
Yes, exactly. Do you want to finish off the data messaging that we have here? Any of the intel that we've got?
Let me
You
have a
convinced me to wind back the property clock 2 times already with the little bits of data that you've already shared. So maybe you could take me back one more time and just go straight
Let
to
me
the
have a
middle.
look. Vacancies are stable. Dwelling starts are down a little bit, but not by only 9% down. So lower. They're not down by as much as in other states. So the forward-looking supply imbalance is maybe a little bit. There's a little more supply coming online in Brisbane relative to other cities.
Yep.
Population increased pretty strong, 2.7%. State economy running pretty good too, 0.6. Final demand growth, which is solid. Unemployment at 4.2, which is a little high. It's a bit lower. So Sydney's at 4 for a benchmark and Melbourne's at 4.5. So yeah, unemployment not exactly shooting the lights out, but yeah, that's probably where the numbers sit at the moment. I have a quick look. Is there anything else?
That's a really, really good summary across these capitals. So we have Sydney, Melbourne, laggards. I'm going to rank Melbourne at the bottom
of the cycle, yep.
Close call. Sydney will give it a run for its money in terms like over price growth over the next 6 months. I'm going to put Melbourne at the bottom. Sydney's going to give it a run though. Sydney's going to challenge Melbourne to have a poor 6 months, I think, between those two capitals. Both around zero though. Like nothing happening. I don't think either of them are going to crash. I don't think it's particularly amazing there. Brisbane, I think, is going to have in the next 6 months 6 to 8% price growth, which maybe 6%, maybe 5% price growth, which correlates to roughly 10% over the year.
Annual,
which is really, really good. And of course, smoking it compared to Sydney and Melbourne. But that doesn't, but I'm also saying that Brisbane is, if I'm a property investor, I'd probably be earring closer towards Melbourne than Brisbane now, even with that information in mind, because I'm buying over the long run. But I wouldn't be investing in Melbourne just yet either. And if I own in Brisbane, I'd probably hold it for a bit more and then look at that potential sell signal in 2025 is probably the time to look at if you want to sell at the top.
Well, you know what that means? If you're not really looking to buy in Brisbane and you're not ready to buy in Melbourne yet and you're not buying in Sydney, then we have to wait for the next podcast,
yes.
Which is going to go through the other states.
So,
all right, we'll run through the others on the next episode.
Yes, if you've enjoyed this one, please let us know because we have really enjoyed producing this. These episodes actually take up a lot of work and time because we dig into the ABS data, the source data, and producing it all. And jump on our YouTube channel. Coming out soon is a full deep dive into every single state with its own episode going in to each of the economic indicators. And something that we do, which, make it fair or not, is I like to read the winds of change, not just what is happening at the moment, not just what the data says, but what will the data look like in 6 months' time and why. This is all speculative, but it does come from the basis of us taking a look at where things are at and looking at where the lending data is at and, informing all that information that we get to try and provide that where could it possibly be and what will the data look like in 6 months' time than rather what it is today. So we're going to deep dive into each state on our YouTube channel, Australian Property Talk with Freedom. Jump on YouTube, hit subscribe there and follow us there too. And you can watch this episode, Kurt and I doing our banter, having our chats on YouTube too. We release these podcasts on YouTube. You can check it out there for those that are interested.